Hey students, today I'm going to talk a little bit about chapter 10, which is on experimental research. Experimental research. So, couple of questions again to think about and discuss. Internal validity threats. So, for example, a study examining whether a prison education program improves post-release employment, then you can identify and explain how you would address these two threats. Number one, A, history, and B, maturation. Discuss these two ideas, these two threats. Question number two, potentially for students who may be interested in factorial design application. So design a 2 by 2, 2 multiplied by 2, or for those of you who may not be as mathematically inclined as I am, 2 multiplied by 2. Factorial experiment test. Factorial experiment to test the effects of two factors on jury decision making. Choose your own factors. Explain A, your factors and levels, and B, part B of the question, what main effects you would examine. So, going on to this chapter and discussing more about experimental research, let's start with history threat. The question originally was about a study examining prison education program, improving post-release employment. As you guys may recall, I mentioned before that I actually did my dissertation on prisoner reentry programs. And I was very interested in the fact that we have close to about a 70% recidivism rate. That means that 70% of the time, people who get out of prison or jail will recycle themselves back into prison or jail 70% of the time. So not imagine those odds, right? If you were a gambling person, actually you could make money. And in fact, some people probably have made money because you can actually buy and sell private prison stock. So, private prisons in the United States. Surprise, surprise, right? So, a history threat. Let's talk a little bit about that. A history threat occurs when external or environmental events, rather than the treatment itself, could cause the observed outcome. So, for example, in this study that I referenced, the prison education program, a history threat could occur if a new government policy expands hiring opportunities for formerly incarcerated individuals. That is a huge deal for people. When people get out of prison, many times they've been out of prison for some year, out of society for some years. They don't have a driver's license, a checking account. They don't have a place to stay. They may have very few clothes. Many times in many states, many prisons also don't really provide anything for ex-prisoners to come out. They give them what's called like gate money, I mean, they exit the gate, $50, $100, maybe a bus ticket to go someplace, and that's about it. There's not really anything else provided in many instances. So that can be a big problem. Excuse me, my throat. That can be a big problem for people trying to re-enter society and become full members of society. And the reason why we have a 70% recidivism rate is because very often they cannot come back and reestablish themselves. So the economy improves. That's another threat, a history threat, but leads to more available jobs. A nonprofit then launches a job placement initiative at the same time as the education program. So it works in conjunction. There's a place for them to exit and to come out of prison and to, excuse me, come out of prison, have a job, some security. They can also have a family if they are, can try to reestablish connections. A lot of students probably know this, but when people go to prison, literally they leave everything behind. Like literally your life stops actually in terms of when you're on the inside. On the outside, of course, life continues for people. People leave behind spouses, girlfriends, boyfriends, they have kids. They have careers and such. People move on. Inside the prison, time can be frozen somewhat because you're in the prison. You can't leave. You can't go out. And so you get out, and suddenly you could be someone who, might have been incarcerated in the early 80s over crack cocaine. And you come out, and when you went in, cell phones were like this big, chunky, big pieces. Now cell phones are this small. And what is this thing called social media? I don't know what this is. What's YouTube? Like, what is this stuff? What's streaming? So you can understand and imagine that things have changed that much. They really have. And so a 30 or 40-year gap is huge. Imagine what even 2-3 years might be like, someone being in prison. So it changes a lot. And it's difficult to catch up with that. It's very difficult. So that's also the big problem. So if you have a government policy expands hiring opportunities along conjunction of a nonprofit hiring formerly incarcerated individuals and job placement, and of course they come out, there's a support system, and there are some some companies and some organizations that actually work really hard to try to bring formerly incarcerated individuals back into society and re-enter them. You know, a good example is, some of you may like bread. I'm assuming maybe most of you like bread. Is a company called Dave's Killer Bread, and they actually were founded by a formerly incarcerated individual, and they specifically try to hire people coming out of prison or jail to re-enter them back into society. Because the problem is, a lot of people are not going to take a chance. They think that, well, you've been in prison, you must have done something. Hey, you know, the justice system does work. Most of the time it does work, that's fair, but not always. Sometimes there are mistakes made. Sometimes people do get wrongfully incarcerated. So that perception is hard to change. Now, of course, in these cases, increased employment might be incorrectly attributed to the prison education program when it actually was influenced by outside events, meaning the nonprofit that created a job placement initiative at the same time. So how you can address it, how you can try to manipulate that history thread and assess it properly? Well, use a control group of similar individuals who do not participate in the education program. Ensure both groups experience the same external conditions. And of course, apply a pre-test, post-test control group design, which helps then isolate the program's effects by comparing changes between groups. By comparing the outcomes between treatment and control groups, researchers then, eggheads like myself, can of course better determine whether employment gains are due to the program rather than historical events. Maturation threat. Maturation threat is a big one too. So a maturation threat refers to changes that occur naturally within participants over time, independent of the treatment. So for example, in this context, formerly incarcerated individuals may gain motivation to find employment as time passes. They develop life skills, which they develop life skills and maturity, wisdom gained over time after release. They also adjust psychologically to life outside of prison. So when you're in prison, you're in a box with bars in the windows. And unfortunately, people's mind shifts change a lot. Prison is very traumatic. It's very stressful, no matter who you are. I mean, you could be 6'7" or whatever, 7'1", but it doesn't matter how big you are. Mentally, it's a very tough place to be. Mentally, it's very hard. You don't really have any friends. You have maybe allies at most. You don't have any friends. You probably have a lot of enemies, possibly, or you'll make enemies. Unfortunately, the longer you live on this planet, no matter what job you're in, but especially in prison, you're going to make some enemies. That's just how it is. Now, these natural improvements could then lead to better employment outcomes, even without participation in the education program. How you can address it, these threats. Again, use a control group so that both groups experience similar natural changes over time. Use random assignment to ensure both groups are comparable at the start. Implement a post-test only control group design, which the chapter discusses can control for maturation because both groups are equally affected by time-related changes. By ensuring that maturation affects both groups equally, researchers can then isolate the true impact of the education program. Now, excuse me. The other question was about Factorial Design Application. So let me talk a little bit about that. Let's say, for example, and going back to the example, the question I was referring to earlier, design a 2x2 factorial experiment to test the effects of two factors on jury decision making. Choosing your own factors, of course. Explain A, for example, your factors and levels. B, what main effects you would examine. So A, let's say researchers can investigate how two independent variables jointly affect an outcome, in this case, jury decision making, by conducting a 2x2 factorial experiment. Additionally, this design allows for the evaluation of individual main effects as well as potential interactions between the factors. First, consider the strength of the evidence and the defendant's demeanor, two elements that are likely to affect jury decisions, juror decisions, right? Individually, for example, let's say. But the strength of the evidence is a big one. The defendant's demeanor, even what they're dressed and wearing in court, that makes a big difference. That's why there are laws that state that defendants must not be wearing prison uniform or in shackles when they're in court. In some states, they don't allow that. because it can prejudicially bias the jury to already consider psychologically and unconsciously that the defendant is guilty. So that's why many times you see on court TV and other television networks, even fictional, the defendant, when they're brought in front of the jury, they're dressed in appropriate courtroom attire, usually a suit and tie. So it makes a difference. It establishes some legitimacy that this person may be guilty, but they may not be guilty. But they seem to be a very clean-cut, handsome, well-shaven person. So, maybe there is something to this person. He might be innocent. So those are things to consider, of course. There's strong evidence, such as unambiguous forensic evidence, trustworthy eyewitness testimony, and weak evidence, such as circumstantial or ambiguous evidence, are two possible levels of evidence strength. Now, of course, eyewitness testimony has been proven many times to not be that trustworthy, actually. And many factors play a role in that, unfortunately, because people's memories are not really that accurate. What they see and hear is not really that accurate many times, right? Unless there's a recording somewhere. The defense demeanor can also be classified as either non-remorseful. For example, the defendant appears cold or uncaring or remorseful. The defendant maybe appears cooperative and apologetic, or, embarrassed to be there, or other factors. There's an old joke about a lawyer who brings in a client who's accused of murdering his spouse. But the wife's body cannot be found. The police look everywhere for the body. They can't find it. They can't also find the murder weapon. But they believe under a great deal of circumstantial evidence, that the man did indeed kill his wife. So he's brought up on charges by the prosecutor's office, and he goes to the trial. And there is enough, gray area that the defendant's lawyer tells the jury in closing arguments that, listen, there's no body, there's no murder weapon. The police don't really have anything except some eyewitness testimony and some other circumstantial evidence. This is just not enough to convict the defendant, my client. And also, you should know that the wife is actually still alive. And any moment now, in the next 2 minutes, she's going to walk through that front door, and here she comes. And he looks over, and all jury's people look over. And the lawyer says, hey, well, look, nobody came through the courtroom door. But this tells me that you have a lot of doubt in your mind still. So on that basis alone, you should consider the fact that my client should be found innocent and not guilty. So please go back to the jury room and deliberate and take your time. But know that if you have so much doubt, he can't be guilty. He must be innocent. So the jury goes back and comes back a few hours later, and it hands a verdict of guilty for the defendant. And so the lawyer is amazed. How is this possible? They all look. The lawyer goes and talks to the jury and does a poll of the jury afterwards. He talks to the jury foreman. He says, look, I don't understand. I told you guys that the client is innocent, and the wife is going to walk through the courtroom doors. How is it possible you did not know about this? And I mean, you thought that he's still guilty. What happened in the jury room? So the jury foreman smiled. He said, well, look, that was a very clever argument. You made a good argument. I like you. You're a good lawyer. And if I get in trouble for murdering my wife, I want to definitely see and look you up. But you made one big mistake, unfortunately. You should have conferred with your client. Because while all of us were looking at the door, at least one of us was watching your client. And your client didn't turn his head. Which means that he knew the wife was not going to walk through the courtroom door. So he had killed her, obviously. Or he had someone else kill her. But he knew that she wasn't going to walk through the front door, through the courtroom door. So on that basis, you probably should have conferred with your client if you're going to pull a stunt like that. So that's why we found him guilty. So always, if you're a lawyer, or you're going to be a lawyer someday, always confer with your client for any strategy. If he had done that, and he had his defendant, client, look at the courtroom door, he might have been found innocent. Maybe that's not a good thing either, but you get what I'm trying to say. That's based on a true story, I think. So, lastly, to finish up this question over here, the impact of evidence strength in jury decision making will be the first of the primary effects investigated in the design. Regardless of the defense behavior, researchers would examine whether participants are more likely to render guilty verdicts when the evidence is strong as opposed to weak. Secondly, regardless of the strength of the evidence that's put forth towards a jury, the impact of the defendant's demeanor will be investigated by comparing whether juries are more likely to convict a non-remorseful defendant than someone who looks remorseful. In addition to revealing each factor's independent influence, this factorial design lays the groundwork for examining possible interaction effects, such as whether demeanor is more important when the evidence is weaker than when it is strong. So these are all factors to consider when you design the application. So again, always consider you need to talk to your lawyer, have clear communication of any kind of strategy. That's a good thing to do. Lastly, my thanks again for all you guys who hung in there, and I appreciate you taking the time out today to hear me blather away, and I hope you enjoyed my true lawyer story, and it may prove useful for you someday for some of you who may become lawyers sometime. Thank you again.